Good morning, everyone. Well, I'd like to begin with two stories and a setting, an educational setting. Once upon a time, a church youth group was setting up in a forest clearing for dinner. And a campfire, when one of the boys discovered that he'd lost his penknife. It had been given to him by his father and was of great value to him. Other activities ceased, and the group helped him to look for the knife for a long time without success. Frustration and discouragement set in. Finally, the group's adult leader gathered the teens around her. If you were the adult leader, what would you do? Just think about that for a moment. This story goes on to say that the adult leader prayed aloud with faith and fervor. Dear God, I ask you to help us find this penknife. I ask that you do this not because the knife is important, but simply as a sign of your power and glory. Within a few minutes, the knife was found. The leader gave thanks that God had indeed responded to her prayer and that the teens had witnessed it. This story troubles me. Oops. Second, a contemporary and best-selling fantasy story. Like some of you, I've been caught up for several years, along with my family, in the saga of Harry Potter. In revisiting the final novel in J.K. Rowling's 7-part series last summer, I was drawn to the subplot that involved Ron Weasley, Harry's best friend, and the conflicted love interest of Hermione Granger. Apologies if you haven't read this yet, there are spoilers ahead. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the last book of the 7-part series, Ron is bequeathed a unique object called a deluminator from Professor Dumbledore. It is quite useful when one needs to create darkness suddenly, since clicking its switch causes it to suck all light from a room into itself. Although, as Hermione notes, Peruvian instant darkness powder would do just as well for the purpose. Hitting the switch again sends the light back out. The deluminator, however, has a hidden function as well. When Ron, frustrated by the fruitless character of the threesome's quest to block the evil designs of you-know-who, Lord Voldemort, breaks away from Harry and Hermione and goes back home, he keeps the deluminator with him. One night, he hears his name spoken from it in Hermione's voice, and a pulsing ball of light emerges from the object. He knows somehow that he must follow it, and the light goes inside him. Guided by it, he is able to return to his friends and take up the burden of their mission once again. What strikes you about the story of Ron and the deluminator? How might it be a story for theology and religious education? Again, just think for a moment. I'm intrigued by this story. Third, an educational setting. Seem to be out of order, but bear with me. When I teach graduate ministry students to do theological reflection, we typically follow a model of one student presenting a particular experience from his or her ministry, followed by group analysis and prayerful reflection on it. We draw upon our faith tradition, our own experiences, social sciences, and other sources to illuminate the experience. Our most fundamental question in this reflection is, how might God be working here? Responses to this question usually revolve around the conviction that God is active within the presenting student and in the contours of his or her ministerial situation to bring loving compassion and responsible action to those in need. Again, what are your thoughts? Especially, how is this like and unlike your own educational practices? I'm impelled by this setting. Accordingly, I want to frame this address as a conversation about our various stories of divine activity within our own religious traditions and communities, and of our encounter with differing stories, for the sake of authentic storytelling and story practicing in our postmodern context. I do this fully cognizant of my severe limitations in speaking from any tradition other than my own. Thus, what I say is heavily influenced by my Catholic Christianity. As Mary says, I'm pretty immersed in that world, as well as my particular ethnicity and social location. Yet I hope to be both honest and evocative in this dialogue. So, why am I troubled by the penknife story? I have difficulty with the youth leaders calling on God for recovery of a possession of one of the teens, and for the presumption that God will interrupt the forces of nature and somehow make the object visible to the group. Further, I object to the implication that this sort of summoning by us to address our particular concerns is congruent with the way that God may choose to be active in our lives. Why am I intrigued by the Deluminator story? Not because I think that Rowling in the Harry Potter series is articulating a theology of divine activity. Rather, I think that the predictable dual functioning of the Deluminator, in which it captures and releases light at the touch of a button, and its unpredicted role in leading Ron back to his friends and his mission, can help us to meditate in helpful ways on divine activity in a postmodern world. Why am I impelled by the educational setting? Because my vocation as practical theologian and religious educator drives me toward the most adequate or least inadequate ways that divine mystery and its work may be glimpsed today, whether through teaching, praying, serving, or doing justice in the world. In what follows, then, I will briefly note two contemporary scholars' efforts to articulate divine presence and agency in our contemporary context. I'll then name two theological themes that I think are helpful for the interpretation of God's activity in the world: the dialectic of kairos, chronos, and the practice of asceticism. Following will be some comments that will be kind of open-ended on how I see practical theology and religious education contributing to this interpretation in distinctive yet overlapping ways. I'll conclude with, I hope, an opening to further conversation among us that is heavily influenced by the conversation that's already begun among us. So first, the theology of a God of interruption. Belgian Christian theologian Lieven Bouvet, in God Interrupts History, makes the case for a necessary focus by theology on historical context as the place where God acts. He insists that, quote, given the fact that God reveals God's self in history and that it is precisely in history that God can be known by us, history ultimately becomes co-constitutive of the truth of faith. Bouvet characterizes postmodernity from his European context as detraditionalized, individualized, and pluralized. Here, our description, he says, of how to characterize God's self-revelation in history is best framed not as correlation with its modern assumptions that Christianity and culture can readily speak to one another, nor is it best framed by an anti-modern withdrawal from engagement with the world in favor of the linguistic cultural framework of Christianity. Instead, the concept of the Christian experience of God as interrupting history allows for both continuity and discontinuity between faith and context, between, in his case, being Christian and being human. It is not rupture, so Christian experience remains connected with all human experience. Yet neither is it a facile equating of God's will and activity in all things with Christian categories, for revelation can never be fully encompassed through human expression. Interruption, says Bouvet, quote, signifies an intrusion that does not destroy the historical narrative, but problematizes the advance thereof. It involves an intrusion of an otherness that only momentarily, but nonetheless intensely halts the narrative sequence, impelling us to open toward that otherness. Bouvet calls for a theological project of ongoing recontextualization that can facilitate this understanding of God's activity through the continual reinterpretation of faith, context, and tradition. This is best done with sustained awareness of the parallel projects of religious others, walking our own path along with those who are walking their own paths, with no one having a bird's eye view of where the paths will eventually lead and whether or not they'll come together. And Bouvet also says, even though he's critical of correlation, he does say at one point that what he's talking about is a kind of postmodern correlation that he wants to frame as recontextualization. Our own Gabriel Moran is also intensely concerned with how we experience and describe God's self-communication in history, calling his most recent book, Believing in a Revealing God. He critiques the tendency of church leaders to encapsulate revelation in a deposit of faith inherited from our forebears, to be assented to by believers today as universally and exclusively true. Instead, he argues for a much more inclusive understanding of, quote, revelation in the natural world, in other religions, and in the whole of Christianity, end quote. Such an understanding will avoid relativism, like placing our truth in dialogue with others' truths. He perceptively outlines ways that Christianity can learn from the other great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, through deep consideration of their understandings of revelation and appropriate human response to it. I admire these creative and evocative theological efforts, both by Catholics, yet facing both inward and outward in their concerns. Both give me clues toward the interpretation of the penknife story and the deluminator story in a dialectic I'll call Chronos and Kairos. Let us move now to consideration of those terms. From the perspective of religious believers, history is suffused with rumors of the divine. Yet we're disposed to live mostly within the clock time of Chronos, measurable, predictable, quantitative time. This is the notion of time as a period of time that dominates Western thinking, with Greek origins as well as ancient Hebrew usage and later treatment in the Christian Testament. It tends to accompany the ways we expect the world to work. This, of course, is not a bad thing. In Chronos time, we can be like Ron, using the deluminator like a flashlight. Because it is so entirely predictable and reliable, it can be life-saving, as when Ron uses it to help his friends escape the pitch-dark dungeon of the evil Voldemort. For religious believers, I think Chronos can also be construed as the everyday sense of our faith and the practices that we consciously cultivate to nurture that faith. And so our habitual ways of invoking the divine and seeking to enlighten others about God can be largely dependable. We rely on the proven tools of the trade in order to form and to educate. The youth leader in my story undoubtedly relied extensively on clock time and the attributes that accompany it in organizing the group. Planning the logistics, recalling the best of her past practices in designing the activities, collaborating with others to accomplish all the tasks, prayerfully reflecting on her goals and on each of her youth members, and so on. Time in the Hebrew and Christian scriptural senses, however, is more often akin to kairos. Time as qualitative, as point in time, whether it's a short or a long point. Such time is suitable to the purpose, as in the natural seasons of planting and harvesting, or the rising and setting of the sun. It is a special kind of chronos. It can also be perceived in the key life events of humans, such as the time of birth, of growing from childhood, having children, reaching death. Finally, Kairos points to the periods of God's favor or judgment, above all in the day of the Lord, the day of salvation. Yet it is not wholly distanced from Chronos, but is found within it. According to Henry Yaker, quote, "This day," referencing Deuteronomy 29:14 and following, "is every day only because one discerns the Kairos each day and is able to renew one's commitment, and not because this day is metaphysically different from every other day," end quote. Kairos then reminds us that all of nature and human activity is subject to God's time and its expected fulfillment. Yet we can and are called to cooperate in the divine activity and to celebrate its past gifts through ritual and storytelling that helps us revisit Kairos and renew the possibilities for its manifestation in our times. Why is this night different from all other nights? Do this in memory of me. As noted regarding the Hebrew scriptures, awareness of eschatological time, of the inbreaking realm of God, can sustain hope in believers, especially through times of trial. In our emerging postmodern worldview, how can we best understand and participate in time in concert with divine activity? The scriptures of Jews and Christians give us assurance of God's continual activity. Muslims also assume this and shape their educational efforts accordingly, as RE scholar Amjad Hussein tells us. And so I'd like to think that Kairos possibilities lie beneath the surface of all Chronos activities. What bothers me about the youth leader's prayer, however, is that she attempts to bring the Kairos moment through summoning God's power for the specific request. Peter Hodgson refers to this as the personal action model of God's participation in history, in which God intervenes directly in the world in superhuman ways that interrupt normal processes. The youth leader is exhilarated at the outcome of her prayer. Yet, while it could lead to deepened faith for the whole group, and it certainly made the knife owner very happy, it leaves the group vulnerable to occasions when God might seemingly ignore their prayer and not exert divine power for their specific need. And it narrows their vision of God's concerns and God's proving ground to this one request, this one need. I don't think Lieven-Bouvet has incidents like this in mind when he speaks of God interrupting history, or Moran in his convictions about a God continually self-revealing in our history. Bouvet's notion of God interrupting history does not imply that, as in the penknife story, God intervenes miraculously at the request of fervent petitioners. Instead, God interrupts our tendencies to believe that we have unfettered access to divine presence within the parameters of our own faith tradition and our own interpretation of it. We are invited to seek the divine presence through awakening to Kairos moments, both within our own religious communities and its encounters with others, and with the creative spirit animating our natural cosmos. In particular, Peter Hodgson tells us, quote, "What God does in history is not simply to be there as God, or to call us forward, or to assume a personal role, but to shape a multifaceted, transfigurative praxis. God does this by giving, disclosing, in some sense being, the normative shape, the paradigm of such a praxis," end quote. I see the deluminator's hidden function, its unpredicted capacity to lead Ron back into the community of his friends and courageously to resume his mission with them, as a better analogy for the mysterious activity of the divine. God, like the deluminator's unknown use, is present all along. Kairos exists within Chronos. Human recognition, trust, and cooperation are necessary to glimpse and respond to God's presence. This leads not primarily toward the satisfaction of individual desires, but to a larger world-redeeming purpose. We seek to shape and reshape the forms of our theological interpretations in order to dispose ourselves to the divine mystery. And Maria Harris and Gabriel Moran have just given me over and over that image of the shaping and the reshaping as key to all education. And so let us consider what will foster our openness to kairos, our cooperation in God's interruption for transformation. I propose another theological theme to characterize our human response to the kairotic praxis of God, the practice of asceticism. Here is a term that has long roots in Christianity, but has fallen out of favor in recent times. For Jews, it may have some resonance. It is certainly part of Muslim tradition. It is safe to say that many religious traditions carry some affinity for ascetic practices, often associated with actions of self-mortification and purification of heroic efforts at prayer. I can't resist telling the story of St. Kevin. St. Kevin of Glendalough, I have a son named Kevin, so we researched this story. But it's a classic asceticism story where there's St. Kevin who is in his monastic cell, and it's so small that when he stretches out his arms to pray, he has to put an arm out the window. So he's there praying one day in his ascetic position, and a bird lands on the hand out the window and starts to build a nest. And he, being not only a good ascetic, but also a great lover of nature, keeps that arm out there, lets the bird build the nest, lay the eggs, hatch the eggs. Finally, when the birds fly away, he can put his arms down. So we tease our Kevin with that on his Saints' Day every year. Asceticism, however, is more than this and can be reclaimed for our times. In a widely cited treatment, Richard Valentesis defines asceticism as, quote, performances within a dominant social environment intended to inaugurate a new subjectivity, different social relations, and an alternative symbolic universe. In this expression and Valentesis's extended treatment, the following highlights can be discerned. Asceticism is a practice, a patterned performance. It requires specific types of training, with the root sense of ascesis evoking an athletic stretching of one's capacity. It symbolically and materially engages practitioners in renunciation of one way of life and embrace of another way, thus involving both the exercise and the creation of power and precipitating transformation of self and society. Valentesis argues for the importance of such ascetic practice for identity formation within fluctuating environments, whether ancient or contemporary. I think we need ascetic practices in our times in order to stretch ourselves into readiness to glimpse and seek to cooperate in God's transformative praxis for and through all creation. For Jews and Christians and Muslims, the loving kindness, the unmerited graciousness of God is primary. Yet, our efforts to conform our own actions to it are indispensable. Like the virgins in the gospel who keep their lamps filled with oil as they wait for the bridegroom's arrival, like Samuel lying in the temple of the Lord and learning the proper response to God's call, we need to cultivate that readiness. In a fundamental sense, education is this kind of ascetic practice. Parker Palmer's definition of teaching resonates with the metaphor of asceticism. Quote, to teach is to create a space in which obedience to truth is practiced, end quote. In such space, epistemological rigidity and formlessness alike are renounced to create an open, bounded, and hospitable locus in which kairos, for our purposes here, may be uncovered and its inherent power released. Participants are trained in of conversation and habits of reflection that may open possibilities for new renunciations and new embraces. And I want to mention here especially the amazing experience yesterday of the Dallas Interfaith Women's Dialogue Group as this practice of asceticism, this kind of stretching that they were willing to engage in over and over to come together in the space in that space of hospitality and friendship among them that could turn conflictual, that could turn very tense, very difficult, move out for a time, come back again. It struck me as a real ascetic practice. Here then, I will turn to a consideration of how practical theology and its sibling, religious education, can contribute to the discernment of God's interruptive kairos through ascetic practices. Along the way, I'll attempt to weave together my thoughts with the insights that have emerged through our attention to the conference theme in the months preceding our gathering. As we proceed, I invite you to hold in your awareness an educational setting and participants that are important to you. First, then, a point on practical theology is that it starts in particularity but doesn't end there. While I see both practical theology and religious education as emerging from a common center, our attempts at transformative praxis as joined to the praxis of God, practical theology typically stretches toward the recognition and pursuit of divine presence with close reference to particular faith traditions. With reference to Christian identity, Bouvet insists that particularity is, quote, not an obstacle to universal truth. Rather, that it is within this very particularity that universal truth is communicated and revealed in its fullest realization. Dorothy Bass, Craig Dykstra, and others have highlighted for us the importance of fostering practices in our faith communities that embody what it means to be faithful over time. Bouvet adds to this through his articulation of the specificity of all religious experience within the lives of faith communities. Speaking from his Christian perspective, he says, quote, religious experience then primarily refers back to the actual faith life of Christians, a life of being initiated into the Christian tradition and participating in the life of the faith community. Within the density of the concrete, contextually situated faith life, in which narrative, interpretation, savoir-faire, perception, praxis, signification, and reflection are interlocked, close quote. Central stories will be especially significant in these dense practices. For example, Bouvet points to the Hebrew scriptures to the Exodus event as forming a structuring pattern for new experiences of God's salutary involvement in history, experiences which simultaneously gave new shape to the Exodus God experience, end quote. I think this recognition of such kairos times in our past becomes a vital opening to ascetic engagement with our present, stretching these central structuring patterns so as to discern God's interruptive action in our times. Practical theology, however, cannot be restricted to the setting of church or synagogue or mosque. Swinton and Mowat define practical theology as critical theological reflection on the practices of the church as they interact with the practices of the world, with a view to ensuring and enabling faithful participation in God's redemptive practices in, to, and for the world. And so practical theology also needs extracommunal settings and concerns itself with extracommunal events, stretching to embrace the entire earth, in order to sponsor habits of readiness to participate in kairos. In the pre-conference issue of our journal, Kathleen O'Gorman's beautiful essay on grace, as experienced in both human and non-human elements of creation, is a helpful reminder of this. Second point about practical theology. Practical theology is about a cycle of praxis for cooperation with God's activity in care for the world. How is transfigurative praxis to be accomplished? Practical theology affirms that a hermeneutical cycle of practice to theory to practice, to use Don Browning's expression, is necessary. Many of our REA APRI colleagues have developed fruitful praxis approaches for varied religious educational settings, such as Ann Streety Wimberly's IDEA model for African American youth and Tom Groom's shared praxis. We might characterize the entire praxis cycle as ascetic. It requires a disciplined engagement in multifaceted conversation and channeling the resulting power in a sustained orientation toward common action. Here, I believe that Bouvet, who is not writing as an acknowledged practical theologian, needs to be challenged in his claim that our foremost postmodern priority should be to engage with others, not to focus on finding commonalities. He argues that, quote, the other is not in the first instance an ally or familiar partner, but rather one who challenges our narratives in his or her irreducible otherness, end quote. Yet, yes, but how can we respond collectively to Kairos in our present world crises without seeking allies? Using a praxis cycle will impel us toward common action for the transformation of our practices. Now I'd like to shift the focus to religious education as the other direction to which we may stretch from our shared central commitment to transformative praxis. Religious education and the cultivation of post-conventional faith consciousness in postmodernity. In thinking about this year's theme, as was reflected in my essay for the pre-conference journal, I assumed a close sibling relationship between practical theology and religious education, seeing them, if not as identical twins, then perhaps at least fraternal ones. Some ensuing conversation on the blog and during our meeting, however, have helped to sharpen my sense of the distinctive strengths that religious ed, and perhaps our association in particular, contribute to theological reflection on divine activity in our times. First then, an education for post-conventional perspective as a direction that religious education stretches us. Our Harper awardee this year, James Fowler, led religious educators as well as practical theologians in exciting new thinking regarding how developmental theory could illuminate stages of faith across our lifetimes. And I had this in the address even before I knew Jim and Lurleen were going to be here this morning, so appreciate their presence. Fowler's long-term work on his stage theory brought him to a mature orientation toward the importance of post-conventional faith, faithful change, and the public-oriented stance of faith communities. In her analysis of Fowler's work, Hyung-Soon Kim states that for Fowler, unlike, say, Habermas and Kohlberg, quote, rather than necessarily leaving behind the particularities of one's religious tradition in moving toward post-conventionality, the members of a religious community appropriate the symbolic depths of their tradition in ways that lead them to see through the tradition in two ways. They not only form a critical perspective on their tradition, seeing through its limitations, especially in the particular form practiced by their own community, but they also draw upon its various beliefs and practices as a means of acquiring new openness to the perspective of others, seeing through its symbols to the value and dignity of others. In other words, Kim says, they achieve a post-critical stance toward their own tradition, the second naivete that Fowler appropriates from Ricoeur in order to describe conjunctive faith, end quote. If you recall, conjunctive faith is stage 5 in Fowler's stages. Fowler built upon his early faith stage work with individuals to study congregations as collective embodiments of such structural development. He wrote with a clear concern that such faith communities should sponsor religious education as systematic formation for their members. This attention to formation echoes Maria Harris's work on the great forms of the curriculum that education seeks continually to reform in faithfulness to mission. But it also points to the need, affirmed by Fowler, for congregations to develop post-conventional faith in their members in order to participate responsibly in postmodernity as public bodies. Johannes van der Ven, an empirically oriented European practical theologian, highlights the capacities for role-taking and perspective exchange in persons who manifest Fowler's stages 4 and 5. This leads van der Ven to assert that the churches are called to interreligious perspective exchange, in which each person interprets one's own religion from an insider perspective and the other's religion from an outsider perspective. enabling this in both global and local contexts. Gabriel Moran, in his Believing in a Revealing God, similarly speaks of the need for scanners, people who can speak both insider and outsider languages. Fowler then offers a wonderful opening for religious educators to use their expertise in social sciences and the best of educational practices to foster post-conventional perspectives. Such education work is vital to equip us for the challenges of postmodernity and for the healing of the human community and the earth. My final point then picks up on some of our conversations before and during this annual meeting to raise the challenges and potential contributions of our association for the future. And this is quite open-ended, and I think going from last night's conversation, it certainly needs to be. REA's place in the present and the future, question mark. Gabriel Moran began a provocative thread in the blog this fall on the future of REA APRI. In responses to him, Dean Blevins and Jack Seymour both spoke of approaches that I think can point us to both Kairos and ascetic practices as an organization committed to religious education, with a particular emphasis on looking outward. At a moment in Western societies of declining influence of religious bodies on many people's lives, multiple associations exist to foster congregational and denominational identity. Many of REA's former practitioner members seem to have departed in favor of these associations of particularity, we might call them. Noting this, Dean, in his blog comment, challenges us to stretch our self-conception as a group that lives, quote, on the margins, boundaries, borders of our disciplinary interests, particularly those cognates that inform religious education, including culture studies, science, technology, social policy, interreligious dialogue, and so on. But he says, what may distinguish our organization from practical theology may rest with our willingness to be more descriptive in these engagements, rather than feeling compelled to adjudicate the overall worth based on presumed theological convictions. Now, Dean says, I do not mean that we have no convictions, but it strikes me the organization may be better suited to suspend these convictions, at least early in the engagements, out of respect both for the diversity of our constituency and the opportunities we have to engage a larger public discourse, end quote. Jack Seymour also offered the example of our journal to ground his assertion that, quote, the vocation of REA is to be the international and interfaith forum for religious education. I believe those who leave REA for a practical theology association miss important aspects of reflection on learning in a religious tradition and across religious traditions for the good of the world we together inhabit. Each of our colleagues is raising here, I think, the challenge to deluminate, to darken our particular faith commitments in the association so as to move to the boundaries of interfaith, interreligious learning, as well as placing ourselves at the margins of the many non-theological disciplines from which we need to learn. Then, when we flick the switch again, what new illumination will we have? And what will we see with it? Does this viewpoint contradict that of other scholars in both practical theology and religious education who urge us to let our particular faith lights shine in cross-disciplinary and cross-religious dialogue? What sort of asceticism, of suspension or renunciation is called for in our association? What shall we embrace instead? How will we recognize and respond to the kairos in our midst? Perhaps in the future, we will look back on this time in REA APRI as a kairos moment, in which we all began to see and name the mysterious activity of the divine among us in new ways. I hope that our naming will be stretched beyond that of the youth leader, however happy that story's ending. I hope that our association will lead us and those whom we educate to relinquish our exclusive holds on God and to expand our prayer and our disciplined action to embrace the entire provenance of God in society and creation. May any deluminations be for the sake of greater illumination for all.